Thank you so much, Nicole. And it's a real pleasure to welcome back Dr. Gerald Hickson to the collaborative webinar stage, virtual as it be. Dr. Hickson is the Joseph C. Ross Chair of Medical Education and Administration, as well as a professor of pediatrics at Vanderbilt. Jerry is a world-class health services researcher whose research has focused on a variety of topics, but really included seminal work related to communication and resolution programs on why families choose to file suit, why a certain proportion of physicians affect more than their share of claims, and then how to identify and intervene with high-risk clinicians. And that was research that led to the foundation of the CPPA program that he started and continues to play an important role in, that helps use data from patients and from coworkers to promote safety and professional accountability. Dr. Hickson has had multiple senior leadership roles, both at Vanderbilt, but also at other organizations. Most notably, currently serves as the chair of the board of directors for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And I personally owe a great debt of gratitude to Dr. Hickson for his support of the work on communication and resolution programs, professionalism, as well as for a lot of mentorship for me personally. So, Jerry, thank you very much for joining us again. Dr. Hickson will be addressing CRP and someone throws you a curve. Are you prepared? So take it away, Dr. Hickson.
So, Tom, thank you. And I appreciate this opportunity to engage with colleagues who are trying to make medicine kinder and safer every day, and the work is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Now, today, as Tom mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about when someone throws you a curve. I'm a baseball fan. Those who know baseball from years ago know about Nolan Ryan, and everybody always expected fastballs, but sometimes in our work, we will encounter a surprise. And when we do, it is a learning opportunity. Next slide. Now, a strong bias that I have is that when we think about safety and high reliability, yes, we have to have intentionally designed systems. They need to be informed by the best research in human factors to make it as easy as possible for humans to do the right thing. But as you can see from this image, and I'm looking at one of my favorite topics, this notion of washing our dang hands. I can put up as many foam dispensers, sinks, and all of those things to make it easy to do a very fundamental safe act. It still requires professional accountability. The professional must understand that respect for other humans, respect for our established safety practices requires more than just systems. And so as I talk today, I will come back to the fact that we have a responsibility to address both. And as we think about our CRP plans, the notion is if we are committed, and what makes them so important is going from the traditional deny and defend. We now commit to doing the right thing and discovery, understanding why, and as quickly as we can, addressing those issues to prevent recurrence. Now, let's go to a case. We don't want to talk about this hypothetical. Let's go to a case that occurred in a large unnamed institution. JW is a 26-year-old with right lower quadrant abdominal pain, and this pediatrician knows that with these findings, imaging is likely, and the imaging supports the notion of an appendicitis, and I want to get this individual to the right OR, and JW is added as an add-on case for one of the busy surgeons, and the procedure is performed, and we go off to recovery. Next slide. The problem was JW continued to have abdominal pain and fever, and so another imaging study is obtained, and it reveals a foreign body. We go back to the OR, sponge is identified and removed, and JW has a challenging set of days in the hospital for both treatment and pain management, and then goes home. Next slide. Now, communication resolution programs are such an important step forward. And I love the definition that they represent a principled, comprehensive, systematic approach to support responding transparently. And write that word down because we're going to come back to what transparency means. And empathetically to unintended patient injury. These three fundamental principles are incredibly important. If a patient is harmed by inappropriate care, we're going to move quickly to address the patient's need, to provide explanations and understanding, and to address their needs and to apologize. Now, if care is reasonable, we're going to do our best to provide explanations and rationale for why we believe that care was reasonable. But this third element is so important. Professionals, and you see I'm going to use that word professionals. Brandeis says that professionals are individuals who have a body of knowledge. They're constantly working to strengthen, improve that body of knowledge. They do what they do for the purpose of others, supporting others primarily. And the third issue that Brandeis comes back to is this notion of our responsibility for accountability as individuals and as groups. So one of the things that I think makes the CRP stand out is this notion that, gosh, professionals are going to protect others by learning and acting on what we find. Next slide. The following is just simply a generic claims management roadmap that I borrowed from Rick Boothman. And when there's an unplanned outcome, it's reported. We go through a period of early notification. If you look at the center of the slide, then we go to what I call fact-finding and discovery about the case. And then based upon what we find, and in this particular case, it is not reasonable. The patient should not have departed with a foreign body, and we have some responsibility to make right with the patient and family. Next slide. But I'm going to assert to you, and I'm going to ask you right now to go to your Menti, and you can go to menti.com, and we'll leave this code at the top, 964-5-16-47. And I want you to think about the elements that you have where you live and work that are, I think, important to assess and understand a case, specifically JW's case. So number one, how do you do with respect to reporting within your environment? Gosh, this organization does a great job with reporting. Well, we're sort of average. Gosh, we have some opportunity, as we say in Tennessee, to do more better. Second element, who do you have participating? Do you have widespread engaged participation? Gosh, we're sort of average in getting people in to participate in the assessment. This is an area that needs a little work. The next issue is, gosh, what's our ability to assess our systems of care? There was a system in place that got those sponges to the OR, got them used, and either get them removed or not removed. And how do we have the ability when we have an event like JW's to go and do a little examination? What's our strength in terms of assessing team function? How's our team doing? Is this a world beater team? Gosh, we're going to finish about middle in that pack. Gosh, we need to do better next year in the draft. And a last assessment I'm going to ask you, based upon the assessment of Brandeis, or the assertions of Justice Brandeis, how do we do with assessing professionalism of team members during care delivery in terms of the case in question? Now, I warned Tom Gallagher that I would ask him in a moment to make a comment or two about what he sees, but I'm going to encourage you to continue to vote your system where you live and work. Gosh, we really got this nailed. We're average. It's fine. We do okay work. Gosh, we have some opportunity here. Tom, what do you see, and what comments would you make? And if there are others that want to comment on the chat, I'll try to look in there and ask Tom those tough questions. Tom, what do you see?
I think it's so interesting, Jerry, that across the board, people are noting areas for improvement, with none of these domains standing out above the others. I would say the most common thing we hear from organizations when we talk with them about communication and resolution programs is, that's a great idea, and we already do it. And then you have to ask them, well, sort of, how would you know? For reporting, you may have a better sense of deficits because events come to your attention way down the road that you wished you had known about earlier. But even that is an imperfect measure of strengths and opportunities in this area. So it's great that folks recognize that there's room for improvement across the board, but I would ask people to continue to reflect on, well, how do you really know how things are going? Sometimes it's not until a really awful event happens and you realize that the systems you had in place weren't performing as optimally as you thought. Obviously, that's a situation that you would like to avoid.
And Tom, I want to follow up by, I really like picking up on the language. These are improvement opportunities. In any single moment, humans may view a similar circumstance differently. We bring new people into our health systems on a daily basis. And in those circumstances, what do we do to be sure that we orient team members that it is who we are, that when disturbances in the force occur, that they are reported and we move, and we want everyone's ideas. Thank you for responding, and let's go. We may come back to this and look at this a little more later. Next slide. So based upon our particular, and let me comment right now, I see that Michelle Lloyd, most incidents are filed by staff and do not necessarily capture adverse events from physician care. And again, let me tell you what an important issue this is, that we all are a part of this team with important observations, because we need to understand what's occurred so that we can collectively think about how to address. We'll come back and cover that again. Thank you for raising that. And so in this particular circumstance, knowing that this is an event that should not occur, that there was a sponge, it's been removed, and following our pathway, it's time to share with the family. And so Dr. Surgeon, who is involved in care, our perioperative nursing leader, our chief of staff, and our risk manager at this hypothetical institution, scheduled to meet with the patient to share findings, plans to prevent that we don't face this again, that others face this again, and to introduce discussions of compensation since there are consequences to the patient. The challenge was that Dr. Surgeon was called away for an emergency. The leaders proceed to share findings. The findings were that, gosh, it was an add-on case, very busy, don't really understand, but my counts, our counts must have been incorrect. Next slide. The curve that occurs is that JW, the patient, begins shaking his head and declares, in this real case, that's exactly what Dr. Surgeon said you'd say. And then proceeded to say to the leaders that are in JW's room, what I want to know is, what are you going to do about your terribly deficient, poorly trained staffing? In fact, when I'm in the OR, it is really hard to focus on surgery while I have to keep one eye on the inexperienced nurses. It was just chaos in that OR. And JW continues, as I understand it, your rules call for nurses to count, right? Next question. Next slide. So you're standing there in JW's room. You didn't hear or recall anything about chaos in the OR. You may not fully align your view with the description as reported by JW. What do we do? What do you do in a circumstance when you get the unexpected? Do you agree? Do you tell JW, well, that story's just not right? Or do you investigate? Maybe that story is right. Next slide. One of the things that we've learned in an organization that I'm affiliated with is that sometimes when we are faced with an unexpected issue, and if the issue's true, if the assertion's true, this becomes an event that needs our attention, not later, but sooner. And so what we found is that having an established huddle process is so beneficial, so that as soon as this report is shared with the leadership team, they ask JW's permission to have a patient relations rep come to the office to capture the story, to record it into our safety event reporting system so it could be logged in. And then we want to be sure that we have the right parties immediately involved in thinking about this challenge. And so the huddle process occurs within 4 hours of this report occurring, with representatives from the appropriate team that might be involved. This is just an example as a slide, but there's almost always medical chief of staff personnel, service line chiefs, nursing administrators that will be appropriate for the area of care delivery, risk management, HR, if there are issues about human performance, and representatives of our professionalism committee. The reports, and in this case, this story would be sent out, reviewed by individuals representing these groups, and in a 6-minute meeting, we've learned to process so that the committee's not deciding the answer to the truth. How are we going to assess this particular assertion and direct our next steps? So does this particular report warrant investigation? By what office? Who's accountable for following up and being done? And I love this question, within 5 days, because we need to move along. Who's going to notify political leaders, local leaders, if they need to be aware? And are there concerns about the well-being of parties who may be involved? Especially if our nursing professional in our OR are working in a chaotic work environment. Next slide. Turns out an investigation, a reinvestigation was occurred. And let me remind you, this is a reinvestigation because there was an initial assessment based upon our ability to ask and answer the questions that you answered earlier about the case and understanding the why. But the group decided we needed to go re-interview the team again. Experienced nursing staff, but what was a consensus story from multiple individuals within the room. Dr. S walked in, slammed the door as he entered the OR. First response could be heard by everyone: I need the patient on this OR table now. Then turned to Dr. Anesthesia, who was standing there, and said, can I talk with you in the hallway? The two of them departed into the hallway, at which point Dr. Surgeon asserted to Dr. Anesthesia, you need to get this patient to sleep. I already have to deal with this second string nursing team, let alone your rookie anesthesiologist. Everyone in the room can hear. Dr. Surgeon re-enters the room. Everyone listen. While we do our timeout, I'm Dr. Surgeon. I'm taking this patient's appendix out. Anybody got any questions about the timeout? No, that's really good. I don't want to waste any more time. Next slide. As Dr. Surgeon began to close the patient. So we go to that portion. Now, this is alien to me because as a pediatrician, I don't know anything about that stuff, but I'm told by my good nursing colleagues that we close before we begin to close the fascia, and then we have a second closing, and we declare those things out right loud. But as Dr. S began to close, nursing team began the count. Dr. Surgeon asked the nurse to answer his pager. Turned out to be someone in the emergency department that needed some advice, and it clearly agitated the surgeon. He instructed the nurse to put the phone to his face so that he could continue to close the patient. And then there was a heated discussion, which no one really understood. And at one point, Dr. S told the nurse to quit moving because he was having trouble talking on the phone. I can't talk on the phone while you are moving around. Next slide. After the phone call, the circulating nurse tried to complete the count, but Dr. S asked that she call one of his partners. That was just continuing mess. And ultimately, the count was completed and marked as correct. The team believed. Next slide. You ever been involved in an event, circumstance, in care delivery where things were sort of out of control? But the question I'm asking all of you, and Tom, I'm going to ask him to wax eloquent in a minute. None of this behavior came out in the first evaluation of this case. The only thing that was heard, it was busy, add-on case, must have missed a count. Why was the behavior as observed, experienced in the OR, not shared in the initial case review? And how does that contribute to a curve you may face as we seek to be transparent with patients and families in our communication responsibilities aligned with CRP? So wax eloquent. This is a scrolling, this is not a scrolling grid. This is a word cloud. And so Tom will see some things and he'll look and focus on the big words, but he'll also focus on the little words that often have lots of insight as well. So I'm going to encourage you to continue to share your observations, and these things will roll in. And Tom, whenever you feel ready, please wax eloquent.
I think everyone can appreciate the issues around sort of psychological safety and fear, intimidation, those sorts of things. One of my colleagues is a sociologist who spent a lot of time working on what's called politeness theory, which is an area of great interest in other disciplines. And I don't think it's received enough attention in the healthcare space. And it has to do with sort of our expectations for what our relationships with one another will be, and how do we sort of create and maintain, for lack of a better word, face and our reputations. And what are we willing to do or not do for the sake of sort of getting along and harmonious social relationships with one another. Doing things that appear to be impolite require enormous amounts of psychological sort of courage. So I think there's much that the field can learn about from other disciplines about what are some of the theories and models that govern the way we interact with one another, and how does that affect the behavior that emerges in really challenging situations such as this.
Tom, thank you for that. And I'm going to give you another opportunity to wax eloquent again before we move forward. But we see the fear. May be real. These nursing professionals had 3 years and 5 years of experience respectfully. But you know, that's something that we may never completely go away. Number two, there were processes. It's always amazing to me that I can go to the manual, find the process, and there's the process. And so I'm going to say processes for some reason not followed in the moment. There is no question that at times there are power disparities that exist. Sometimes there's inexperience with not having been there before. And unfortunately, this is not an event circumstance that I want everyone to experience. But gosh, we need to be prepared to act as we can. And sometimes there is just this notion that nothing is ever going to happen about Dr. S, that for some reason, this individual has a special status that may exempt them. The other issues that you see down here are guilt, because it is the notion that, gosh, this is not our best. And in the evaluation now, I need to face the notion that that count was not right, which becomes a second challenge where the patient is affected, our team members are affected for some very traumatic learning. Any other comments, Tom, that you would make at this point before we press along here just a bit more?
Well, we're asking healthcare professionals to make a series of really challenging choices. And in the moment, have we equipped them to make a choice that feels risky? That where it's not the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance in this case is just sort of putting your head down and thinking, I just need to move on with my day. And it requires a lot of courage and psychological safety to decide to take an alternate path than just letting this ride.
Tom, here. And the other issue that I'm going to ask is, gosh, it turns out there is a resident and an attending anesthesiologist in this room. And in that circumstance, one also asks the question about why. But when we have behaviors that do not honor and model our established safety practices, we create this very uncomfortable, dysfunctional system where things may occur, and yet individuals that are professional and are in a position to influence, and as the great Supreme Court justice says, gosh, it's a part of self-regulation. But to Tom's point, are we equipping and protecting people to do so? Next slide. This is not a New England Journal of Medicine study, but there's an interesting paper in Vital Smart that simply did a convenient sampling of nursing professionals, but it's very telling. Concerns often not discussed. And the question was, have you witnessed acts of disrespect? Have you witnessed medical incompetence? Have you witnessed dangerous shortcuts like trying to have a phone call with an emergency medicine physician while you're sewing up a patient? Less than 35% in this particular interview acknowledged that they spoke up or shared their concern. And the notion is, this is our challenge. Next slide. Because the question I'm going to ask you as well is, gosh, for Dr. Surgeon, is this a part of regular performance, or does this represent an anomaly? Just had a bad day. Circumstances were aligned in a way it just wasn't right. Here are 3 additional reports about this individual in a relatively short period of time. The nurse reported after scrubbing noted that no initial count was done. I asked if an x-ray was needed. Dr. S became hostile and actually in this case said, hit the road, Jack, and don't come back. Scrub nurse reported, Dr. Surgeon asked me if I hated my job because I did it so badly. A third report, I asked Dr. Surgeon to pause before closing because we had no tech to do a count. Completely ignored me and just proceeded to close. What you see on the right is a national distribution curve from our collaborative. We have now about 300,000 professionals. And at this particular point, this individual, when we compare them to all other general surgeon, has the 94th highest risk score out of approaching 2,000 general surgeons, because this represents a recurring pattern of performance that impacts the ability of the team to achieve its intended outcome. Next slide. Why is it important to address? Number one, because we don't know about the health and well-being of Dr. Surgeon. Let's not forget that in the process. Number two, we know that any of us that are participating in this conference today, if we happen to receive care from a physician that is modeling disrespectful behavior, we know that we are 20 to 30% more likely to have surgical site infections, to return to the operating room, to go back to the ICU, to be reintubated, to have sepsis, and a host of other medical problems. We know that when we look at trauma care, in a study we did with about 100,000 trauma victims, we found that if the teams that compose were delivering the care, if they had a disproportionate share of disrespectful team members, mortality was 24 to 30% higher compared to others who did not have that same experience. We know from our early studies that physicians who model disrespect account for 50 to 70% of your institution's malpractice claims and cost. And from general studies of disrespect in any workplace, we know that disrespect creates a ripple effect. Team members withdraw. They have more anxiety in the workplace. They lose creativity or don't use creativity because it's too risky. Learning declines, and motivation and departure goes up. Next slide. Two really good studies, one done by Katz, one of our colleagues at Mount Sinai, the other done by Rishkin, a pediatrician. So pay very careful attention to this particular study, because always listen to pediatricians. But one of the things that Katz did that I found so fascinating, they did a simulation study in which they created two conditions: a condition of respect, a condition of disrespect, in a simulation where an anesthesia resident, senior resident, was exposed to an unexpected or charged to support an unexpected retroperitoneal bleed. And then using a tool to assess performance, looking for errors. Look at the error rate in the controlled, respectful condition. People weren't warm and fuzzy. They just were respectful. An 8.8% error rate. You look at the residents that went into the simulation where it begins with the surgeon being disrespectful. The error rate goes to 36.4% in that simulation. We know that individuals who were in that room with Dr. S, in this hypothetical case, are not focused on their duties and responsibilities in the moment. They're distracted. They have less situational awareness. They are less likely to speak up when they observe things, and they are less likely to ask for help. Next slide. One of the things that Tom alluded to, we created a model years ago that we now have been operationalizing 25 years, and we now are approaching over 300 hospitals where we do this work, and we find the same distribution, 4 to 6% of team members, nurses, and physicians at every institution. And the good news is that we start engaging them early and often. Remember, I'm a pediatrician. It's early and often, so that when a disturbance of the force comes in, Dr. Surgeon was about to make an incision, but I stopped him so we could perform the timeout. He mumbled, "Aren't you a bossy cow? You cannot make these things up." The individuals in the room did not think that was respectful. And within this environment, the event was reported, and within 48 hours, a peer would knock on Dr. S's door and share this disturbance in the force. It's not therapeutic. It's not designed to get an apology. It simply says, Dr. S, this event was reported, seems inconsistent with our core value. I know there are two sides to every story. No, there are two sides to every story. The only thing I'm going to ask you to do is reflect, if you're in this circumstance again, might there be some other way to proceed? I leave that to you. I trust you. You're an important member of the team. Have a nice day. It's done empathetically. You listen, but it's important to deliver. That's called a cup of coffee. Now, the good news is most individuals will self-regulate. And so when we look at distribution, we find that 80% of individuals will not get another one. Actually, 90% will not get another report. But if they do, we've learned how to identify when we have now gone from simply sharing coffee to there appears, listen to the passive language, there appears to be a pattern. And we want to be sure that we make you aware and encourage you to self-regulate. Failing to do that moves up to an authority-guided intervention for the very few, less than 0.5% that are unable or unwilling to respond. Next slide. But here is what I want to share with you. This is the work that we started at Vanderbilt back in 2007. We managed to get 10 to 15 reports of unprofessional behavior a year. We started delivering them one at a time, trained peer messengers. We don't embarrass, we don't humiliate, we trust our colleagues, and we don't investigate 94% of those reports, just deliver them. 6% are sorted because they involved assertions of physical contact, sexual boundary issues, discrimination. Those issues always get investigated, but 94% do not need it. They just need to be delivered. And what you see is that over time, and only over time, team members will come to believe that we're serious. And that when they submit an observation and story, it will be dealt with, as was answered on one of those first Mentimeters, in a predictable, reliable way, supported by a right process that gets the right support to Dr. Surgeon. That's what this is about, and those that work with him. Next slide. We published a paper a month ago, 14-year study looking at claims experience of high-risk clinicians. Frank Sloan, one of my colleagues at Vanderbilt years ago, published a study looking at the distribution of malpractice claims, looked at all suits against all physicians in the state of Florida for a period of 10 years. And what he reported was that 3 to 8% of individuals by discipline account for that 50 to 70% of claims experience. Randy Boberg, who was with the Urban Institute, came behind him and asked the question, gosh, does the past predict the future? If you're high risk today, where will you be 10 years from now? And the answer is, unfortunately, the same place if the organization does not act to address the curbs that it will face in attempting to roll out its CRP program when they get unexpected messaging. Our research team then pursued this notion: can we identify high-risk professionals by some manner other than just counting lawsuits? We identified the fact that if you observe, record what patients and families say, not a survey, but unsolicited patient reports or reports by fellow coworkers, they will help us reliably identify our high-risk colleagues. Next slide. And then this represents a study that we recently published. We've done this study before in large academic institutions, large regional medical centers that are self-insured. This study was done with a group of 260 orthopedic surgeons spread over 2 states who created, with our partnership, a plan to capture those same observations made by patients and families and to use peers within the orthopedic practice to provide feedback. Those 42 high-risk individuals experienced an 83% reduction in claims, and overall in the entire practice, an 87% reduction of claims. Now, what pleases me is that it's not here today, gone tomorrow, but this represented now 12 plus years of sustained reduction. Next slide. Dr. S's can be encouraged, supported, and helped, but you got to engage. Remind you again, my favorite Supreme Court Justice, Justice Brandeis, a profession has a body of knowledge that requires extensive preliminary training. That's what we've done, and is owned by the profession. And it distinguishes it from mere skills. Now, I want skills, but I want skills and the wisdom to use it. Number 2, he wrote that this was an occupation pursued largely for others, not solely, but largely. But he continues to come back to this notion of obligation for self-regulation. We spend a lot of time explaining why, gosh, Dr. S must be struggling. He may be. And we don't know how to support him if we don't engage him. Gosh, these systems are bad. They may be, but 92% of his colleagues conduct themselves as professionals, and I would assert are more effective in sharing how we need to fix and change our faulty systems. But that self-regulation. Do I pause every day before I walk into a healthcare setting and say, when I walk into this room, this space, do I make it easier or harder for other team members to do their job, like counting sponges, like assessing timeouts, like addressing the thousands of things that all of our fellow colleagues have to do in any single day? Next slide. The other issue I want you to remind you about is Dr. S, because the failure to address Dr. S may be a missed opportunity for this individual personally. One of my good colleagues, Betsy Williams, psychologist, has done a lot of writings, a lot of great work with professionals that, for whatever reason, wind up at the top of that professionalism pyramid that I showed you. There are individuals that need evaluations. And as a pediatrician, I do not have the ability or right to speculate, to do a physical or history on Dr. S. And we often get into trouble when we begin to think we understand why Dr. S behaves the way he or she may. And what Betsy reminds us is that, gosh, professionals who cannot work well with others and cannot follow standard rules, they need a professional who has the ability to look at their capacity, the individual's broad capacity to perform, assesses their capability, their knowledge, their skills required for the task. I mean, does Dr. Surgeon know how to pause and allow the team members to count sponges? Being a little facetious. And finally, the ability to perform, to implement right behavior in the moment, and to maintain that behavior and performance over time. And if they can't do it, let's get our colleagues to the right resources that they may need. And the last question I'm going to ask, and then Tom will leave some time for, I hope, a question and answer, but I'm going to have one more Minty. I want to challenge everybody here that's participating. The time to address Dr. S, I sure hope, is before he enters the next OR. What can we do to begin to move us in the right direction so we can support Dr. S, who had an underlying diagnosis. We can support the nursing professionals that have to go into that same OR day in and day out and anticipate what they're going to experience so that there is silence at wrong moments. What can we do for the patient JW and the next patient? And again, I want to call out one of the special things about the notion of communication resolution programs is that third fundamental element that we are going to explore, discover, and address what we find. And most of the time, there'll be dysfunctional systems, but occasionally, it'll be a Dr. S that's suffering. Tom Gallagher, what would you say? I'll turn the floor over to you, and I see there is a question there potentially. So great question. I'll answer this, and then Tom, I'll turn it back to you. It took me forever to decide that we should move this process along, but I'm pleased to report that 6 years ago now, a group of our nursing professionals came to me in 3 sites, one at Keck Medicine on the West Coast, one at the University of Iowa and at Vandy, and said, we want to roll this process out for our nursing professionals. And let me tell you, after 6 years, absolute same distribution curve, same kinds of complaint reports, same willingness of peer nurses to be trained to go deliver a cup of coffee, and awareness as required, the same response rate, and the same very tiny percentage of individuals who need more than self-reflection. Great question. Thank you.
I would also love for people to reflect and share in the chat either now or in a minute. Dr. Hickson has set the stage for the leaders at the organization who had an initial conversation with the patient's parents. All sorts of new information came up based on information, presumably, that Dr. S has shared with them. We've learned new information about how this sequence of events has happened. What, if any, of that information should be shared back with the parents? We're so used to thinking about really an ironclad dome of protection over information that could be construed as peer review information or QI information. But as we've articulated in the past, when you try to think about what are standards for deciding what information to share about a harm event with a patient or their family, what information to withhold, and this is an area where I would say we're wandering out into an area where there are some best practices, but we're a little bit in undiscovered country here, which is why I think these webinars are such a helpful opportunity to think together. In a prior session, we articulated a standard of materiality as the basis for deciding what information should be shared with patients and families about a harm event and what information should not. And by materiality, we mean basically, is this a piece of information that if you don't share, the patient or family would have a fundamental misunderstanding about what happened? That may not be the perfect standard, but I'd love to hear folks' thoughts about, so now that we've collected all this additional information and have a clearer understanding of the sequence of events and how it fits into some of these patterns of behavior of the surgeon, what, if any, of that information is relevant to share back with the parents?
I'm going to encourage Tom, our colleagues, to put this in because I intentionally raise this issue to be provocative, to encourage people to think, because it is ground that we struggled with. And coming out of 25 years ago and 30 years ago, when our research team started its studies, it was all about deny, defend. And gosh, as we move forward, we're going to discover things about Dr. S. JW is going to leave this hospital with an impression of the strength or challenges of our nursing professionals who may be outstanding or may have challenges. And what does that do to their trust in the health system? Now, just as an aside, quickly, because there was a question I want to address, another issue, and then we'll come back to this issue of what do we share. A statement was made, the challenge is when leadership protects the likes of Dr. S, and the answer is exactly right. There are lots of reasons that individuals may protect or appear to protect. And that's why, as we go forward to try to fulfill the declarations and encouragement of Brandeis, I think we need to have these discussions among professionals and leadership within our health systems to ask the question, what are we collectively going to do to support high reliability and safety? And when there is or appears to be a protected individual for whatever reason, what does that do to teams and their ability to perform? And those issues exist because there are those with perceived extra value. I always joke and say it's never a pediatrician, but there are other types that may fill that bill.
Well, and Jerry, it's interesting. We make assumptions in these cases. The leaders are learning in real time that the parents have had a conversation with Dr. S, but is that the only conversation that they've had with healthcare professionals about what happened? What conversation might they have had with the anesthesiologist, with a nurse in the recovery room, with another healthcare professional who has suggested, maybe there's a little bit more to the story. So the parents may have more information than we think about sort of what it's like in the operating room, what it's like working with the surgeon. And you just need to take this into account. I can see, Jerry, we've stumped people with this question of what, if any, of this information do we share back with the family. But I know we've got some brave folks. Liz, Augusta, thank you, and Michael as well. What are your thoughts, Jerry, about Michael and Liz's comments here?
All right, I'm looking at those quick. I'm always slow, so thank you for your tolerance of my slow. So by background, and then I'll go into Michael's comment. When we did our first study, we interviewed 169 families in the state of Florida that had filed suit against their obstetricians asserting for inappropriate care. And we asked them as a part of the study, what prompted you? Why'd you pick up a phone and call an attorney? Not what they wanted, but what prompted that first phone call. And to reinforce what Tom has just said, the single biggest reason that individuals make that initial contact is based upon the advice of what we call an influential other. Single biggest, most common reason. Who's the influential other? It's almost always a member of the medical profession, staff, or team who has another or different idea. It's one of the reasons that I think it's so important that when we talk about fulfilling our professional responsibilities to disclosure, when there is a medical error, you bring the team together quickly to discuss what are the messages, what do we know, what are we working on, how are we going to get information back to the family as we learn more in our discovery process. And failure to see this as a team activity, sets us up, Tom, on occasion for having differences of opinion, even when there's no recognition. It's not intentional. It simply is. And then, part of this also is letting the families know that they've raised issues today in this dialogue, that we need additional assessment, and that we will be back. Because one of the biggest issues I think we have a problem with is that I don't know in the moment that the assertion made by the family or the patient is right or not right. I want an opportunity to do due diligence. The challenge becomes, I go down this pathway, I discover something, I've told the family I'm coming back. Gosh, how do we maintain our professionalism, our integrity, and our honesty, except by sharing with them in as non-judgmental way as possible the assertions? Things were chaotic in the OR. No question of that. There is no question that a sponge was retained. There is no question that all of the staff articulated the fact that it was chaotic within that environment. That's where I begin to be struggling myself. And Tom, I'm not going to sit here before this distinguished group and give them my answer. I'll let them use your answer. Tom, what else do you see there? I'm trying to look to see what else I missed.
Well, so Liz Augusta, who's got a ton of experience in this area, said she would say our performance expectations were not met during your child's surgery. We can't tell you the details of that part of the review because of California law, but we can tell you that steps are being taken to assure that doesn't happen again. Your reflections on that response?
Liz, I'm going to tell you in my own unnamed institution, that's almost exactly what we're going to say. And I think it also relates to the fact that I can do that if I trust my peer review process to address effectively the needs of an individual who, as I mentioned earlier, that we know was struggling. But there are lots of individuals out there that struggle. And the question is, how do we get them the right support? So I think that's a part of that balance that I would seek. Who else has got a challenging comment? All of these are. Tom never has a session in which I don't cringe and say, gosh, how am I going to address this question that I am not sure I yet am comfortable with all the answers?
Well, and I would just include, Jerry, that using the nice verbiage that Liz provided for us, it is an opportunity for our empathic communication skills to kick in and to acknowledge this might be frustrating or disappointing to you that we can't share that information with you. But here's why it makes sense, in this situation, because it's likely to be really frustrating. It also may be an opportunity to explore with the parents, what other conversations have you had, not in an inquisition sort of way. It sounds like you've had some conversations with Dr. S. What sorts of other conversations have you had with the healthcare team that was involved? And did they raise concerns in your mind about what happened? The more information you can get out on the table about what they're thinking, the better.
And Tom, to go along with that, I want to say that's one of the reasons that we want to get patient relations to the rooms quickly, because we want that information and we want to establish a relationship where our patient relations expert can visit regularly. So I want to thank all of you. And gosh, we just continue to try to learn together. Nicole, do we turn this back over to you? Does Tom have a final word?
Oh, we do. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Hickson, for joining us today and getting us to think critically about some of these issues. And thank you, Dr. Gallagher, for adding your commentary. And thank you to all the participants for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, and I can connect you with either Dr. Gallagher or Dr. Hickson for more information. So Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for a great presentation, Jerry.
Tom, my pleasure. And always look forward to an opportunity to think about tough concepts, what I hear from my good colleague, Tom. And you'll get something similar for that publication collection that you're thinking about. And if it's appropriate, good. And if it's not, you'll let me know. But I have gone down this pathway with a little bit more detail.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Take care.